Imagine being told that an enemy thousands of miles away might have built a nuclear force capable of destroying the United States before America could respond. Imagine not knowing where those weapons were, not knowing how many existed, not knowing whether they were hidden in forests, buried underground, scattered across the vast Soviet interior, or already sitting on launch pads pointed toward American cities. And imagine that every piece of information you did have seemed to suggest the same terrifying possibility. The Soviet Union was racing ahead. At least that was what it looked like. By the late 1950s, America had entered an age where nuclear war was no longer a theoretical nightmare. It was a countdown. A missile could cross an ocean in minutes. A warning could come too late. And the difference between having enough weapons to survive a nuclear exchange and being destroyed in the opening strike could come down to one question. How many missiles did the Soviet Union actually have? The United States had powerful aircraft. It had nuclear weapons. It had military bases across the world. It had the technology to build intercontinental ballistic missiles of its own. But there was one thing America desperately lacked: a clear picture of what was happening inside the Soviet Union. The Soviet government was almost completely closed to the outside world. Foreign intelligence officers had limited access. American aircraft could not simply fly wherever they wanted. And on the ground, Soviet military facilities were protected by secrecy, security forces, camouflage, deception, and an enormous geographic advantage. The Soviet Union stretched across 11 time zones. There were forests, mountains, frozen tundra, deserts, remote industrial regions, thousands of miles of territory where a military installation could disappear from the outside world. And somewhere inside that enormous country, American intelligence believed, the Soviets were building an army of nuclear missiles. The question was not whether Moscow had intercontinental missiles. It did. The question was how many. And for a time, Washington feared the answer could be hundreds, possibly more. That fear became known as the missile gap, and it became one of the most consequential intelligence controversies of the Cold War. But then something extraordinary happened. America began looking at the Soviet Union from space. And the photographs that came back did something no speech, newspaper report, diplomatic statement, or military estimate could do. They showed what was actually there. The terrifying Soviet missile army America had imagined was not the force Washington had feared. It was much smaller. In fact, by 1961, American intelligence was dramatically revising its estimates downward. The missile gap was collapsing. And the weapon that exposed the illusion was not a bomb. It was a camera. The birth of the missile gap. The story begins in the aftermath of World War II. America and the Soviet Union had emerged as the two dominant military powers on Earth, but they were not allies anymore. The wartime partnership against Nazi Germany was breaking apart. Europe was divided. Communist governments expanded across Eastern Europe. The United States and Soviet Union began competing for influence around the world. And above everything hung the shadow of the atomic bomb. America had used nuclear weapons against Japan in 1945. The Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. The American monopoly was over. Then came another revolution. The hydrogen bomb. These weapons were vastly more destructive than the bombs used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But possessing a nuclear weapon was one thing. Delivering it across an ocean was another. For the United States, long-range bombers were central to nuclear strategy. But the Soviet Union was developing something that could potentially change the equation forever. The Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. A weapon launched from the ground that could travel thousands of miles through space before plunging back toward its target at enormous speed. There would be no bomber formation crossing the Atlantic, no pilot to shoot down, no obvious warning, just a missile and a clock. The Soviet Union tested its first successful ICBM, the R-7, in 1957. To American observers, this was a shocking technological achievement. The same year the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. To ordinary Americans, Sputnik was a strange metal sphere passing overhead. To military planners it was something else. It was proof that the Soviet Union had rockets powerful enough to place an object into orbit. And if a rocket could send a satellite around Earth, the logic was terrifyingly simple. It could potentially send a nuclear warhead across the planet. America had entered the missile age. But there was a problem. Washington knew the Soviets had ICBM technology. It did not know how extensively that technology had been deployed. That distinction would become enormous. Because one operational missile was not the same as 100. And 100 was not the same as 1,000. But from the outside it was difficult to tell the difference. A superpower in the dark. The United States was not completely blind. American intelligence had spies. It had intercepted communications. It had radar. It had signals intelligence. It had diplomatic sources. It had military observers. And most famously, it had the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. The U-2 could fly at extremely high altitude and photograph portions of the Soviet Union. It was an extraordinary machine. But even the U-2 had limits. It could only photograph what its cameras actually passed over. The Soviet Union was enormous. A flight could examine one area while thousands of miles remained unseen. And that created a dangerous intelligence problem. If you search a small part of a giant country and find no missiles, what have you learned? Almost nothing. The absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. A missile base could be somewhere else. Maybe behind a mountain. Maybe beyond the next forest. Maybe hundreds of miles away. And because American intelligence could not comprehensively search the Soviet Union, analysts had to estimate. They had to build mathematical models. They had to study Soviet industrial production. They had to analyze missile tests. They had to interpret photographs. They had to examine military parades. They had to ask what Soviet leaders were saying. And then they had to make a prediction. How many missiles could Moscow be building? That prediction became increasingly alarming. Khrushchev's nuclear theater. At the center of the psychological battle was Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev understood the power of perception. The Soviet Union did not need to reveal every weapon it possessed. It only needed Washington to believe it possessed enough. He made statements that suggested enormous Soviet missile capabilities. In one famous boast, Khrushchev claimed the Soviet Union was producing missiles like sausages. The message was unmistakable. Moscow wanted the world to believe it was becoming a missile superpower at extraordinary speed. But statements from political leaders were not proof. They were signals. And during the Cold War, signals could be weapons themselves. If Khrushchev wanted American leaders to believe the Soviet Union had a huge missile arsenal, that belief could influence American defense spending. It could influence presidential elections. It could influence military deployments. It could influence negotiations. And it could create fear. The problem was that American leaders could not simply assume Khrushchev was bluffing. What if he was telling the truth? What if hundreds of Soviet ICBMs were already being deployed? What if more were coming? The consequences of underestimating the Soviet force could be catastrophic. So American intelligence planners faced a difficult choice. Assume the worst, or risk being wrong. The political explosion. The missile gap became more than an intelligence question. It became a political issue. By the late 1950s, concerns about Soviet missile superiority were spreading through Washington and American public life. Military planners worried about the possibility that Soviet missiles could outnumber American missiles. Politicians debated whether the United States was falling behind. Presidential candidates used the issue. The fear was simple enough for anyone to understand. The Russians might have more missiles than we do. And if they do, America could be in danger. But the phrase missile gap contained a hidden assumption. That there was actually a gap. Nobody had yet proved it. That was the problem. The United States was trying to measure an enemy force that it could not see. And the less information Washington had, the more room there was for worst-case assumptions. The U-2's dangerous mission. The U-2 was one of America's most important intelligence tools. It was also one of its most dangerous. American aircraft entered Soviet airspace to collect photographs. Every mission carried enormous political risks. If a U-2 were shot down, Washington could face a diplomatic crisis. And eventually, that is exactly what happened. On May 1, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers was flying a U-2 over the Soviet Union. The mission was supposed to photograph sensitive military installations. But the Soviets had improved their air defenses. A Soviet surface-to-air missile struck Powers' aircraft. The U-2 was destroyed. Powers survived and was captured. The incident became an international crisis. The United States initially tried to claim the aircraft was a weather research plane. The Soviets then revealed that Powers had survived. The cover story collapsed. President Dwight Eisenhower had to acknowledge the reconnaissance program. The diplomatic damage was severe. The U-2 flights over the Soviet Union were effectively finished. And America had lost one of its most valuable ways of looking inside the Soviet military machine. The irony was brutal. At exactly the moment when Washington most needed to know the size of the Soviet missile force, one of its most important collection methods had been exposed. The missile gap remained. But the window into the Soviet Union was closing. The search for another American intelligence needed a new method. Something that could look across enormous areas. Something that did not have to cross Soviet airspace. Something the Soviet air defenses could not easily shoot down. The answer was space. The idea sounded almost impossible. Take a camera. Put it on a satellite. Launch it into orbit. Fly over the Soviet Union. Take photographs. then somehow bring the exposed film back to Earth. In the modern era, this sounds almost routine. In 1959, it was anything but. There was no digital storage, no satellite internet, no high-resolution electronic imaging system sending photographs instantly around the world. The camera had to expose actual film. That film had to survive launch. It had to survive orbital conditions. Then the spacecraft had to return the film to Earth. And somehow, American forces had to recover it. The program was called Corona. Officially, it was hidden behind layers of secrecy and associated with the Discoverer series. But its real purpose was reconnaissance. Its mission was simple to describe. Its execution was extraordinarily difficult. 13 failures. The first attempts were disasters. The satellites malfunctioned. Launches failed. Cameras malfunctioned. Spacecraft failed to reach the correct orbit. Film could not be recovered. Capsules were lost. And the American intelligence community waited. Mission after mission failed. 13 attempts came and went without producing the breakthrough Washington desperately needed. Imagine the pressure. The Soviet Union was building missiles. The United States had lost U-2 access. And the new space-based reconnaissance system kept failing. Then came August 1960. Mission 14. This time something different happened. The spacecraft reached orbit. The camera worked. The film was exposed. And the recovery system succeeded. The film capsule returned to Earth. The United States had obtained usable photographic coverage of the Soviet Union from space. It was a technological milestone. And intelligence history was about to change. The first pictures. The first Corona images were not like modern satellite imagery. They were grainy. They were low resolution. They could not show everything. But they had one enormous advantage. Coverage. Instead of looking at a narrow strip from an aircraft, Corona could photograph huge areas. The satellite could search. Could look. It could build a map of Soviet military infrastructure. And slowly, analysts began putting the pieces together. Airfields. Factories. Missile test facilities. Military installations. Transportation networks. Potential launch sites. The Soviet Union was no longer an entirely closed box. A small window had opened. And through that window, American analysts began looking for the missile army they had feared. What the satellite did not find. This is where the story becomes remarkable. The United States expected to find evidence of a massive Soviet ICBM deployment. Instead, the photographs began producing a different picture. There were missile facilities. There were launch complexes. There were signs of Soviet missile development. But the enormous force that some estimates had projected was not appearing. The search continued. More photographs arrived. More areas were covered. Analysts compared images over time. They watched construction. They studied launch pads. They examined support facilities. They looked for patterns. And the numbers began moving downward. Dramatically. By 1961, American intelligence agencies had revised their estimate of operational Soviet ICBM launchers to only about 10 to 25. The United States, by comparison, had 63 deployed ICBMs at the time. The missile gap was turning upside down. The supposedly overwhelming Soviet missile army did not exist. At least not in the form America had feared. 10 to 25. Those numbers were not merely statistics. They changed the strategic picture. Imagine spending years wondering whether an enemy has hundreds of nuclear missiles. Then suddenly discovering that the likely number is closer to a few dozen. That does not make the enemy harmless. 10 nuclear missiles are still 10 nuclear missiles. 25 nuclear missiles can still kill enormous numbers of people. The Soviet Union remained a nuclear superpower. It had bombers. It had intermediate-range missiles. It had submarine-launched weapons. It had nuclear warheads. And it continued developing more advanced ICBMs. But the immediate nightmare of an enormous Soviet ICBM force already poised to overwhelm America was not supported by the evidence. The missile gap was collapsing. And the satellite had helped prove it. The difference between capability and deployment. This distinction is critical. The Soviet Union had demonstrated the ability to build and test an ICBM. That was real. The R-7 was enormous. It was difficult to deploy. It required complex infrastructure. It was not the kind of compact missile that could simply be hidden in a small underground silo. The Soviet leadership understood these limitations. And intelligence analysts eventually concluded that Soviet leaders had apparently chosen to deploy only a relatively small force of these first-generation missiles while pushing ahead toward newer systems. This meant the Soviet Union could possess impressive rocket technology without possessing a huge operational ICBM force. That was one of the great lessons of the missile gap. A country's technological achievement does not automatically tell you how many operational weapons it has. A test launch proves a capability. It does not prove an army. The geography of the Soviet Union. There was another reason the missile gap was so difficult to solve. Geography. The Soviet Union was enormous. The United States was trying to locate facilities across millions of square miles. The problem was similar to searching for a few specific buildings inside an entire continent. An aircraft could photograph a target. But what if intelligence analysts did not know where the target was? A satellite could help by searching broad regions. That changed the equation. Corona could photograph huge areas and give analysts a systematic way to identify what existed. It could also return to the same areas. That allowed analysts to compare images over time. A construction site in one photograph could become a completed military complex in another. A road could lead somewhere. A cleared area could reveal a launch facility. A missile support structure could identify the type of system being deployed. Slowly, the Soviet military infrastructure became visible. The camera became a weapon. The camera on Corona did not destroy anything. It did not explode. It did not fire a missile. But strategically, it was incredibly powerful. Because information itself had become a weapon. A photograph could challenge a military estimate. A series of photographs could challenge an entire strategic assumption. And a collection of photographs could change national policy. The Soviet Union could conceal its missile force from diplomats. It could restrict journalists. It could hide military facilities from foreigners. But it could not easily hide an entire missile complex from a satellite passing overhead. That was the beginning of a new era. The age of overhead reconnaissance. The spy satellite revolution. Corona became one of the most important intelligence programs of the Cold War. Its importance went far beyond the missile gap. Over time, satellite imagery was used to monitor missile complexes, air bases, naval facilities, submarine deployments, and other strategic targets. The United States could watch military construction. It could compare photographs taken months apart. It could detect changes. And perhaps most importantly, it could reduce uncertainty. During the Cold War, uncertainty was dangerous. If Washington believed Moscow might have 500 missiles, military planners had to consider that possibility. If later imagery showed only a few dozen, the strategic calculation changed. The satellite was not simply collecting pictures. It was narrowing the range of possible realities. The spy who added another piece. The satellite was not the only intelligence breakthrough. There was another extraordinary source. His name was Oleg Penkovsky. Penkovsky was a Soviet military intelligence officer who secretly passed information to Western intelligence. According to CIA historical accounts, Penkovsky provided important information about the Soviet missile program and the thinking of Soviet military leaders. His reports helped reinforce the picture emerging from technical intelligence. Soviet claims about missile power were not necessarily a straightforward reflection of actual deployment. Some of Khrushchev's public boasts were, at least in part, psychological warfare. The combination was powerful. Satellite imagery showed what was physically present. Human intelligence helped explain what Soviet leaders were thinking. Two very different sources pointed toward the same conclusion. The missile gap had been badly exaggerated. Why America got it wrong. But how could American intelligence have been so wrong? The answer is not simply incompetence. The problem was uncertainty. Imagine you are responsible for national security. You know your enemy has successfully tested an ICBM. You know the enemy has a huge industrial base. You know its leader is publicly boasting about missile production. You know you cannot see most of the country's military installations. And you know that being wrong in one direction could be catastrophic. What do? You estimate. But estimates depend on assumptions. If you assume the Soviet Union will build as many missiles as technically possible, your estimate becomes large. If you assume Soviet production is limited by technical difficulties, infrastructure, cost, and deployment problems, your estimate becomes smaller. Different analysts can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. That happened during the missile gap. Worst-case thinking. Military intelligence naturally tends to worry about dangerous possibilities. If an enemy might have a capability, planners cannot simply ignore it. The consequences of being wrong can be enormous. This creates a psychological trap. One analyst says there might be 100 missiles. Another says perhaps 200. A third warns that there could be 300. Soon, the worst-case scenario begins to feel like the most responsible scenario. And once a number enters public debate, it can take on a life of its own. The original uncertainty disappears. People stop saying, "We estimate there may be hundreds." They start saying, "The Soviets have hundreds." That transformation can happen surprisingly quickly. And that was part of the missile gap story. Politics made the fear bigger. Military estimates do not exist in a vacuum. Presidents need budgets. Generals need weapons. Congress needs reasons to fund programs. Political campaigns need issues. And the public wants reassurance. The missile gap became useful to many different groups. For some, it justified expanding American missile forces. For others, it became evidence that the government had failed to keep up with Moscow. For voters, it created a simple fear. America might be losing the nuclear race. The reality was much more complicated. But complicated realities rarely make good political slogans. Missile gap did. Kennedy enters the White House. John F. Kennedy campaigned for president in 1960. The missile gap was part of the national debate. Kennedy criticized the Eisenhower administration over perceived weaknesses in American defense. After taking office in January 1961, Kennedy inherited a nuclear confrontation that was already becoming extremely dangerous. But now, intelligence was improving. Corona was providing more evidence. And the picture was becoming clearer. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. It had missiles. But the feared overwhelming ICBM force was not there. This did not mean the Cold War was over. It meant the United States had a better understanding of the balance. And that distinction mattered enormously. From fear to measurement. The greatest achievement of Corona was not simply discovering that the Soviets had fewer missiles. It was turning speculation into measurement. Before satellites, analysts often had to ask, where might the missiles be? How many could there be? How quickly could the Soviets deploy them? After satellite reconnaissance became reliable, the questions changed. Where exactly is the launch complex? How many launchers are there? Is construction continuing? Are new missiles arriving? How large is the support infrastructure? What changed since the last photograph? The difference was revolutionary. Intelligence had moved from educated guessing toward observation. Not perfect observation, but far better observation. The Soviet missile force was still dangerous. It is important not to turn this story into a myth. The satellite did not reveal that the Soviet Union had no missiles. It revealed that the feared scale of its deployed ICBM force had been dramatically exaggerated. The Soviet Union remained dangerous. The nuclear balance remained terrifying. And Moscow was not standing still. The Soviets continued developing new missile systems. The R-7 was eventually replaced by more practical generations of ICBMs. New launch complexes appeared. The Soviet missile force grew. So the satellite did not end the arms race. It changed America's understanding of it. And that might have been even more important. The missile gap disappears. By the early 1960s, the term missile gap increasingly became associated with an intelligence failure. The evidence showed that the Soviet Union had not deployed the gigantic first-generation ICBM force some had feared. The CIA later described Corona as having helped dispel both the missile gap and the bomber gap. The imagery had provided something that had been missing for years. Confidence. Not certainty, but confidence. The United States could finally look across Soviet territory and determine what was actually being built, and that made the strategic environment less mysterious. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Then came October 1962. And suddenly, satellite intelligence mattered more than ever. American U-2 aircraft and other intelligence sources discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being deployed in Cuba. This time, the problem was not an imaginary missile army hidden somewhere inside the Soviet Union. The missiles were real. And they were close to the United States. Photographs revealed launch sites under construction. The images showed Soviet military activity that American leaders could analyze. President Kennedy and his advisors faced an extraordinary crisis. The United States demanded the removal of the missiles. The Soviet Union refused. American forces prepared for possible conflict. For 13 days, the world stood dangerously close to nuclear war. The missile gap had once been about not knowing how many missiles the Soviets possessed. Now America was using reconnaissance to identify exactly where nuclear missiles were being deployed. The age of satellite intelligence had become central to nuclear strategy. The strange irony of the Cold War. There was a remarkable irony. The United States had feared that Soviet secrecy would create a permanent strategic disadvantage. Instead, new technology began breaking through that secrecy. The Soviet Union had built a system designed to conceal military information. America responded by building machines that could see from space. The battlefield was no longer only on land, sea, or air. It was above the earth. Satellites became silent observers. They crossed borders without asking permission. They photographed military facilities from orbit. And because they were so difficult to stop, they changed the relationship between secrecy and verification. From spies to arms control. The importance of satellite imagery eventually extended into arms control negotiations. If both superpowers could monitor strategic forces from space, They could have greater confidence about what the other side was doing. That did not eliminate distrust, but it created the possibility of verification. And verification is one of the foundations of arms control. A treaty is difficult to enforce if nobody can determine whether the other side is complying. Satellite imagery changed that. It gave negotiators an independent source of information. By the 1970s, overhead reconnaissance had become an essential part of monitoring strategic weapons. The technology that began by searching for Soviet missiles had become part of the machinery designed to control them. The hidden cost of being wrong. The missile gap also revealed something deeper about national security. Being wrong is expensive. If America had genuinely faced hundreds of Soviet ICBMs, failing to respond could have been disastrous. But if America responded to an imaginary force by massively expanding its own weapons program, the consequences could also be enormous. More weapons, more money, more tension, more pressure on both sides, and potentially more opportunities for misunderstanding. The nuclear arms race was not driven only by weapons. It was driven by uncertainty about weapons. Every unknown could become a threat. Every unanswered question could become a reason to build more. That is why intelligence mattered so much. Good intelligence could prevent unnecessary panic. Bad intelligence could amplify it. The psychological war. The Soviet Union and United States were fighting on multiple levels. There was military competition. There was technological competition. There was economic competition. There was ideological competition. And there was psychological warfare. Khrushchev's missile boasts were part of that environment. The Soviet leadership wanted to appear powerful. The United States wanted to avoid appearing weak. Each side watched the other for signs of vulnerability. A satellite photograph could therefore be more powerful than a speech. A speech could claim anything. A photograph could reveal a launch pad. Why the Soviet bluff worked? Khrushchev's rhetoric worked because it was supported by real achievements. Sputnik was real. The R-7 was real. Soviet nuclear tests were real. The Soviet Union had demonstrated impressive rocket technology. So when Khrushchev talked about missiles, American leaders could not simply dismiss him. The Soviet Union had already shocked the world. The uncertainty was not whether Moscow was capable. It was how far Moscow had gone. That was the question the satellites finally answered. The first-generation problem. The early Soviet ICBMs were not easy weapons. The R-7 was enormous. It needed significant infrastructure. Its launch process was complicated. It used liquid fuel. It was not an ideal weapon for rapid response. The Soviet military wanted more practical systems. That meant the first-generation force remained relatively limited. Meanwhile, engineers were working on newer missiles. This created a gap between what Soviet rockets could theoretically achieve and what the military could practically deploy. American intelligence had initially struggled to estimate where that line was. Corona helped make the line visible. The power of repeated photography. One photograph can be ambiguous. 10 photographs can tell a story. A satellite might photograph an empty field. Months later it might show construction. Later, launch facilities. Later, support buildings. Later, operational equipment. Analysts could reconstruct the development process. They could measure the pace of construction. They could estimate how many missiles a facility could accommodate. And they could detect whether the Soviet force was expanding as rapidly as feared. This was the true revolution. Not one perfect photograph. A continuous stream of evidence. A new kind of intelligence analyst. Corona also transformed the people who worked with intelligence. Photo interpreters had to learn how to identify military installations from overhead images. They studied shadows, buildings, road patterns, launch structures, vehicle configurations, construction changes. The work required extraordinary attention to detail. A tiny feature on a grainy image might indicate something important. A cluster of structures might reveal a missile complex. A change between two images might show that construction had stopped. These analysts were not sitting in a movie-style control room watching live satellite video. They were often examining physical film. They were enlarging photographs, comparing images, marking features, building intelligence reports. It was slow by modern standards. But for the early 1960s, it was revolutionary. The satellite that changed the balance of knowledge. The significance of Corona was therefore larger than the missile gap itself. It changed the information balance. The Soviet Union could still hide military details. But it could no longer assume that secrecy meant invisibility. The United States could observe from above. That changed Soviet calculations too. Military planners had to assume that important facilities might be photographed. Camouflage and concealment became increasingly important. Deception became more sophisticated. And both superpowers entered a new era in which satellites became permanent participants in the strategic competition. The numbers tell the story. The numbers are striking. American intelligence initially faced estimates that suggested a potentially enormous Soviet ICBM force. The Soviet Union could not hide every potential launch site everywhere. The more territory Corona covered, the harder it became to maintain the assumption that hundreds of hidden missiles were sitting somewhere unseen. The search itself became evidence. And gradually, the empty spaces became as important as the missile sites. The end of the illusion. By the early 1960s, the basic conclusion was becoming unavoidable. America had feared a massive Soviet missile army. But the evidence showed that the first-generation Soviet ICBM deployment was much smaller. The missile gap had been largely an illusion created by incomplete information, worst-case assumptions, political rhetoric, and the extraordinary difficulty of observing a secretive superpower. The satellite had not defeated the Soviet Union. It had defeated uncertainty. And that distinction is crucial. But was it really a spy satellite? The word spy sounds dramatic. But in strategic terms, the satellite was an intelligence collection platform. Its mission was observation. It did not attack. It did not communicate with Soviet commanders. It did not interfere with missiles. It simply watched. That made it one of the most important weapons of the Cold War precisely because it was not a conventional weapon. It was an information system. And information could prevent catastrophic mistakes. The end of the U-2 era and the beginning of space reconnaissance. The U-2 had opened the door. Corona widened it. Aircraft reconnaissance could provide extremely detailed photographs of specific areas. But satellites could cover enormous regions. Each method had advantages. The future would use both. Later satellite systems became dramatically more sophisticated. Resolution improved. Collection became more frequent. Electronic intelligence expanded. And eventually digital systems replaced film. But the basic principle remained. Look from above. Measure what is actually there. Compare it over time. And do not confuse what an enemy says it has with what the evidence shows it has. A warning for the nuclear age. The missile gap story contains a lesson that extends far beyond the Cold War. Nuclear strategy depends on information. If leaders believe an enemy has more weapons than it really does, they may overreact. If they believe an enemy has fewer weapons than it really does, they may underreact. Both errors can be dangerous. The challenge is finding evidence strong enough to replace assumptions. In the 1960s, that evidence came from film returned from orbit. Today the technology is radically different. But the principle remains. When the stakes are existential, knowing matters. The technology behind the truth. Think about what had to happen for a single photograph to reach an American intelligence analyst. A rocket had to launch. A satellite had to reach orbit. The spacecraft had to orient itself. A camera had to operate. Film had to move through the camera. The spacecraft had to survive radiation and temperature changes. The exposed film had to remain intact. A recovery capsule had to return it to Earth. And American forces had to recover that capsule. Only then could analysts study the image. Every step could fail. And many did. That is why the success of Corona was so extraordinary. 13 failures before success. The early failures are easy to forget. History often remembers successful technology. It rarely remembers the launches that went wrong. But Corona's story was built on failure. The United States kept trying. Because the alternative was worse. Without satellite reconnaissance, America had far less ability to measure Soviet strategic forces. Every failure meant another period of uncertainty. Every successful mission created another piece of the puzzle. And eventually the pieces became a picture. The picture of a smaller Soviet force. That picture was not comforting. It was not peaceful. But it was more accurate. The Soviet Union had fewer deployed ICBMs than feared. That meant American leaders could make decisions based on a better understanding of the strategic balance. And once the missile gap disappeared, other questions became possible. What weapons were the Soviets actually developing? Where were they building them? How quickly were they deploying them? What did their force look like 5 years from now? The intelligence problem had evolved. From, how many might they have? To, how many do they have right now? That was an enormous improvement. The satellite and the Cuban crisis. Only a year later, the United States would face one of the most dangerous moments in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The existence of reliable reconnaissance was essential. American leaders needed evidence. Not rumors. Not propaganda. Not assumptions. Evidence. Photographs could show what was happening on the ground. They could reveal missile sites. They could help establish what the Soviet Union was actually doing in Cuba. And they could support the American government's public case. The crisis demonstrated the value of intelligence in real time. The same technological revolution that had exposed the Phantom missile gap was now helping America confront a real missile deployment. When seeing becomes deterrence, there is another subtle effect of reconnaissance. If both sides know that certain military activities can be observed, secrecy becomes harder. That can discourage sudden buildups. It can make deception more difficult. And it can create what later became known as confidence in national technical means of verification. The satellite does not need to stop the missile. It only needs to make the missile harder to hide. That can change behavior. The Soviet Union adapts. Of course, Moscow adapted. The Soviets developed camouflage. They used concealment. They changed construction patterns. They worked to reduce the visibility of military activities. The intelligence competition never stopped. Every improvement in American surveillance created a Soviet response. Every Soviet concealment technique encouraged American technical innovation. This was the Cold War in miniature. A constant cycle. See, hide, improve, detect, adapt, repeat. From film to the modern intelligence world, Corona eventually became obsolete, but its legacy survived. The final Corona mission flew in 1972. By then, more advanced systems were being developed. Later satellites could provide much better imagery. The United States could examine military installations with unprecedented detail. Satellite reconnaissance became an essential part of strategic intelligence. What began as a desperate attempt to find Soviet missiles became an entire architecture of space-based surveillance. The strange legacy of the missile gap. Today, when people hear the phrase missile gap, they may think of a simple story. America thought the Soviets had more missiles. Then America discovered they did not. But the deeper story is more complicated. The United States was not foolish to be concerned. The Soviet Union really was developing nuclear weapons. It really had demonstrated ICBM technology. It really was capable of building more. The danger was real. The mistake was assuming that capability automatically translated into deployment. The missing ingredient was information. Corona supplied it. What if Corona had failed? Consider the alternate history. Suppose the first successful satellite missions never happened. Suppose the technology remained unreliable. Suppose the United States could not obtain broad-area imagery of the Soviet Union. The missile gap might have lasted longer. American military planners might have continued working from inflated estimates. Political pressure might have increased. Defense spending could have expanded even further. And Soviet leaders might have had more freedom to exploit uncertainty. It is impossible to know exactly what would have happened. But one thing is clear. The absence of reliable intelligence creates room for fear. The most dangerous weapon may be an assumption. The Cold War was filled with weapons capable of destroying cities. But some of the most dangerous forces were invisible. Fear, uncertainty, mistrust, and assumptions. If one side believes the other has an overwhelming advantage, it may react aggressively. If that belief is wrong, the reaction itself can create danger. This is why intelligence collection was so important. A photograph could not eliminate nuclear weapons, but it could eliminate one false belief about them. Sometimes that is enough to change history. The Soviet missile army that wasn't there. So return to the original image. America is staring east. Across the Atlantic is a country surrounded by secrecy. American leaders hear Khrushchev boasting about missiles. They know the Soviets have built an ICBM. They know Sputnik is orbiting overhead. They know the Soviet Union is developing nuclear weapons. And they cannot see the full picture. The natural conclusion is terrifying. Perhaps an enormous missile army is hidden somewhere beyond the horizon. Perhaps hundreds of weapons are waiting. Perhaps America is falling behind. Then the satellite arrives. It passes silently over Soviet territory. Its camera opens. Film moves. Images are captured. The satellite continues on its orbit. And eventually the film comes back. Analysts examine the photographs. They search. And search. And search. The giant missile army does not appear. Instead, they find a much smaller force. The numbers fall. 10 to 25. The United States has 63 deployed ICBMs. The feared missile gap is collapsing. The camera wins. No battle was fought. No city was bombed. No Soviet missile was destroyed. But something important had happened. America had gained the ability to distinguish reality from fear. That may have been the most important victory of all. The satellite had not made the Soviet Union weaker. It had made American intelligence stronger. And in a nuclear confrontation, better information could be more valuable than another weapon. The birth of strategic transparency. The Cold War never became transparent, but it became more measurable. Satellites created a new form of strategic transparency. Not complete transparency, Not perfect knowledge, but enough visibility to make certain claims testable. If Moscow said it had a capability, American analysts could search for evidence. If a missile complex was under construction, satellites could monitor it. If a bomber base expanded, imagery could reveal it. If a submarine facility changed, analysts could study the change. The enemy was still secretive, but no longer completely invisible. The silent revolution above Earth. Corona's revolution happened quietly. Most Americans never saw the satellite. They never saw the cameras. They never knew when it passed overhead. They did not watch the film being recovered. But the consequences reached the highest levels of government: presidents, generals, intelligence chiefs, nuclear planners, arms negotiators. All depended increasingly on what could be observed from space. The satellite became a silent participant in the Cold War. Always moving, always watching, always collecting. The lesson for today. Modern audiences live in a world where satellite images are normal. You can look at a map on a smartphone. You can zoom into cities. You can see roads, buildings, coastlines, and landscapes from space. But in the early 1960s, the idea that the United States could systematically photograph huge portions of the Soviet Union from orbit was extraordinary. It was one of the greatest technological achievements of the era, and it changed the meaning of distance. The Soviet Union could be thousands of miles away, but from orbit, it was no longer completely hidden. The intelligence revolution. The missile gap is therefore not only a Cold War story. It is a story about the birth of modern intelligence. Before Corona, intelligence often depended heavily on human sources, aircraft, intercepted communications, and fragmented information. After Corona, overhead imagery became one of the pillars of strategic analysis. It allowed analysts to observe change. It allowed governments to verify claims. And it helped reduce uncertainty between nuclear superpowers. The technology would evolve, but the principle would remain. See first, measure carefully, then decide. The final photograph. Imagine the last image. Not a dramatic launch. Not a mushroom cloud. Not a military parade. Just a photograph of Soviet territory. A launch complex. A few structures. A few missiles. An empty land stretching beyond it. That image tells a story. The Soviet Union was dangerous. But it was not the unstoppable missile machine some Americans had feared. The supposed gap was not what it seemed. And the truth had been sitting on a strip of film that had fallen from the sky. The real victory. The real victory of Corona was not technological alone. It was epistemological. It changed how America knew what it knew. It replaced speculation with observation. It replaced rumors with imagery. It replaced the question, what if, with the question, what does the evidence show? In a nuclear world, that difference could save lives. Because the greatest danger is not always knowing that your enemy has a weapon. Sometimes the greatest danger is not knowing how many. The missile gap was a warning. The episode also remains a warning about intelligence. Numbers can become political weapons. Predictions can become assumptions. Assumptions can become facts in the public imagination. And once fear takes hold, evidence has to work much harder to defeat it. The United States eventually had that evidence. But it took years of technological development. 13 failed attempts. A dangerous reconnaissance program. A new generation of analysts. And one remarkable satellite system. The Cold War above the clouds. The Cold War is often remembered through images of soldiers, tanks, nuclear tests, presidents, and missiles. But some of its most important battles were fought far above the Earth's surface. Satellites crossed the sky. Cameras watched military installations. Analysts studied photographs. And governments tried to understand what the other side was really doing. There were no explosions. No gunfire. No battlefield casualties. Yet the information gathered in orbit influenced decisions involving weapons capable of destroying civilization. That was the quiet battlefield of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was still coming. And perhaps that is the most important nuance. The satellite did not reveal a harmless Soviet Union. It revealed a Soviet Union that was still developing. The smaller missile force was temporary. New generations were coming. The Soviet Union would eventually build a massive strategic arsenal. The nuclear competition would continue for decades. The missile gap disappeared. But the arms race did not. In many ways, the satellite simply allowed America to understand the race more accurately. From fear to strategy. Before the satellite, strategy had been shaped partly by fear of what might exist. After the satellite, strategy could increasingly be shaped by what actually existed. That is the transformation. And it is why Corona matters. Not because it made nuclear weapons disappear. Not because it ended the Cold War. But because it gave decision makers something priceless. A better picture. The image that ended a myth. The missile gap had become one of the defining fears of the late 1950s. The idea was simple. The Soviet Union might be racing ahead. America might be falling behind. The consequences could be catastrophic. Then the photographs arrived. The Soviets had missiles, but not the massive deployed force that the worst estimates had imagined. The numbers were far smaller. The United States was not behind in deployed ICBMs. The gap had been largely a product of uncertainty, and the satellite had exposed it. The camera that changed history. The Corona satellite did something almost unbelievable for its time. It looked down. It photographed. It returned the evidence. And it helped change American understanding of the Soviet military. Today, surveillance satellites are so familiar that the idea can seem ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about the first successful film return reconnaissance missions. They represented a leap from the age of secret borders to the age of overhead observation. The Earth itself had become an intelligence map. The lasting legacy. By the time Corona ended in 1972, the world had changed. The United States had a much better understanding of Soviet strategic forces. Satellite imagery had become central to intelligence. And the concept of monitoring military forces from space had become permanent. The missile gap was gone, but its lesson remained. When two nuclear superpowers are trying to understand each other, information is not a luxury. It is a form of security. And sometimes, the difference between panic and confidence is a photograph. The final thought. In the late 1950s, America feared that somewhere inside the enormous Soviet Union was a missile army it could not see. The fear was understandable. The Soviet Union had demonstrated astonishing rocket technology. Its leader boasted about missile production. The United States had limited access to Soviet territory. And the consequences of being wrong were terrifying. Then America launched a camera into space. The first attempts failed. Again and again. But eventually the satellite worked. The film came home. And the photographs told a different story. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. It had ICBMs. It was dangerous. But the gigantic missile force America feared was not there. The numbers were dramatically smaller. The missile gap was collapsing. And for the first time, Washington could look beyond Soviet propaganda and beyond its own worst fears. It could see. That single ability changed the Cold War. Because in a world where one misunderstanding could trigger nuclear war, seeing the truth was itself a strategic weapon. The Soviet Union could hide behind secrecy. It could build walls. It could restrict access. It could make speeches. It could boast. But above the clouds, a small American satellite kept moving. Silent. Invisible. Patient. And every time its camera opened, another piece of the Soviet secret world became visible. The missile army America feared had been largely an illusion. The satellite did not destroy it. It simply revealed that it had never been there at the scale America imagined. And that may be the most powerful lesson of the entire Cold War. Sometimes the weapon that changes history is not the one that destroys the enemy. Sometimes it is the one that proves what the enemy actually has. Because when the world is balancing on the edge of nuclear war, the most dangerous thing may not be the missile. It may be the unknown. And in 1960, America finally found a way to look into that unknown from space. The camera had won. The missile gap was over. And the Cold War would never look the same again.